Hello, you've got Eli and Chris from Landlord Gurus here, and we're back. We've talked in the last couple of weeks about how to set up the best advertising listing for your vacancies. And we've also talked about how to set a list of criteria by which you're going to select a tenant, both so that people who are interested in the unit know what's expected, as well as a good checklist for you to follow to make sure you get the best tenants. So today we're going to go into the pre-screening process and questions that we suggest that you ask early in the process so that everybody knows what they're getting into. You don't waste time. We figure out whether or not it's a fit early on. So first couple of questions are, what are pre-screening questions and why do we ask them? So Chris, take us away on that stuff.
Got it. So pre-screening questions, like you mentioned there, just questions to confirm and to verify from the potential applicant that they will meet your criteria that you've set, that you've talked to them or showed them or posted in your application. So it's to just to reconfirm that. And it's, like you mentioned at the end of the day, is to save everybody a little bit of time so that if everybody that wanted to come take a look at it, if you scheduled an appointment to show it, you could be pretty busy and there might be a lot of people who at the end of the day are just not qualified and didn't read the ad. If you say no smokers and they are smokers, so it's just to get a lot of that out of the way in advance so that you're not wasting everybody's time.
Right. I actually in practice find that most people just can't remember everything from every listing that they're looking at. Some people, particularly smokers and people who have pets, will hope that it just doesn't come up. So I make sure to cover those basics. While we're talking through this, we do definitely want to emphasize that it's really important to make sure that you follow the FHA laws about discrimination against protected classes very carefully. And in this setting, in this context, often what comes up are service animals and emotional support animals. Those are covered under the people with disabilities category, which is a class of people that you absolutely cannot and should not discriminate against. So be very careful with that. Get legal assistance if you need it to understand. And can't state that the importance there. So, all right. And there are a couple of different times and ways that you can ask these pre-screening questions. Chris, why don't you talk about what you put in your listing that communicates some of this stuff?
Right. So the very first opportunity for you to kind of start the pre-screening process is during that listing ad. And so, we've talked about this before with the rental criteria checklist, but it's sort of reiterating that if you don't allow pets, or if you don't allow smokers, or if you have an income to rent ratio, you specify all that in your advertisement, the length of your lease, the start date that you want to have the vacancy filled by, the rent, security deposit amounts, whether, we're stating the fact that you will be doing credit checks as we recommend, credit checks and tenant screening and employment verification. So things like that you put in the ad, and that's kind of your first opportunity to start the pre-screening process. People who see that and they understand that they may not be qualified, for them, they can just stop the process right off the bat.
Yeah, one I've just added is in the listings is to communicate that I require renter's insurance. Some people will have feelings about that.
Right.
There. So, okay. So the next opportunity is during the correspondence that goes on once a party has expressed interest in renting the place. They reach out to you and say, hey, can I have more information? And I'd like to see the place. So this is where I do most of my pre-screening. In the very first response to anybody that's interested, I ask, do you have animals of any kind? I don't call them pets because I'd like to know whether or not there's an animal, no matter what classification they are.
Animal, yeah.
Right. And does anybody who lives here smoke in any form of any substance? I'm trying to narrow down people who smoke as opposed to people who say they don't smoke inside. And when are you going to move in? When do you want to move in? Sometimes, it's May now, and sometimes they want to move in August. So there's a big time waster if you don't get that lined up. And have you given notice to your existing landlord? That's one that I don't always do, but I think it's a good idea. And do you have that income to rent ratio that I'm looking for, which for me is 2.5 times. And then I say 2.5 times after you paid any of your big debts like student loans or cars and that type of thing. So once we have asked all of the basic pre-screening questions during the correspondence, we set up a appointment to show the apartment, and either before we do that or during the showing, it's a really good idea to ask a bunch of open-ended questions that are kind of get to know you oriented, get to know the situation. So I usually do it during a showing, and I ask, where are you coming from today? Who usually tells me where they're living, or they tell me something about their situation. And have you lived in Seattle, which is where I am, for long? Do you know these neighborhoods? And I'll often learn all kinds of things. Where do they work? That type of thing, without having to ask a lot of detailed questions, and just kind of opening the air up. So, Chris, do you have any of those that you?
Yeah, I do the same thing. I ask those questions, and sometimes I get good responses. Sometimes it's I have to ask a little bit more, and it might be, how much are you currently paying in rent, or why are you moving now? What's your current situation? Where do you work? Are you moving to be closer to work? Things like that. So yeah, it's conversation starters. It's getting to kind of extract more information to see whether they meet that qualification,
Right,
criteria standards that you set.
Right. And then once we're done with the showing, I always invite people who have seen the place to feel free to reach out to me with any other questions. So it invites them to kind of follow up, and people always have questions afterwards, or often do. So keep the communication going, especially if it's somebody I'd like to have apply. And then there is the step where you've done the showing, and I do kind of an internal evaluation about how it went, not just objectively, but the nuances of how it went. So, Chris, I know you've talked about, did they park in a no parking zone? What are some other things that you note and take away that inform your decisions?
Yeah, so this is sort of like your last opportunity to do pre-screening. You might not be asking questions at this point, but in my mind, it's still part of that pre-screening process. And it is, like you said, it's observing whether they have followed the rules. Did they in a no parking spot, or did they remove their shoes? If you have a sign that says please remove your shoes, or please put booties over your shoes, did they follow those rules? If you've got a no smoking policy, did they light up a cigarette while they're inside? I don't know, things like that. Again, it's an indication, and it's sort of that pre-screening process where you can see if they're going to be a good fit, whether they're going to take care of your property, whether they're going to respect you and respect your time.
And some of these things we actually put here in Seattle, we put these in the criteria, which is communicated along with the listing. So obey all posted notices and rules of the property, that type of thing.
Right. So if they don't follow those rules, you have a documented response. You can say, yeah, you don't qualify because you didn't meet these criteria, which entails showing up on time.
Yeah, that's an important one, because that often doesn't happen. Okay, so let's jump back just a little bit to before the showings actually happen. So we had a couple of tips that we'll link to them below. But showing tips, make sure that you get the place really clean. Get it looking as good as it can. I get there early. I sweep anything that needs to be swept. I open blinds. I turn on lights. I'm there on time to greet people. It's just the niceties of creating the best impression possible. And just like we want them to do that with us, it pays to show that you care, and it creates much better outcomes.
Exactly. Yeah, and along the same lines, show the entire property. Like if you got storage units or storage rooms and bike storage, show that. Even if you've got areas that maybe don't look the greatest, common areas that maybe don't shine, whatever, but show them everything. You don't want tenants to discover things that they may not be happy about later. And again, you don't want to mislead anybody at the same time. So, I'd say, well, first and foremost, make sure that those places do look good. Like you talked about before, clean, sweep, things like that. But, if there are things, just make sure you show everything.
Yeah, and I take the opportunity to talk up the neighborhood too during that time. So, Okay, well, Chris, I think we covered what we set out to today. So should we call it a wrap on this edition? And we'll be back in the next week or so with kind of the next step in filling a vacancy. So in the meantime, please subscribe to this channel. Please subscribe to our newsletter. Like everything that we do. And if you would, send us comments. And above all, just come back. So thanks very much for watching.
Thanks. See you.